Metalstorm is a lesser-known game from the developer IREM, better known as the creators of the R-Type series. While it shares some similarities in design and pacing to R-Type, it also happens to be one of the most unusual platformers ever to grace the Nintendo Entertainment System. Even though this game was featured on a cover of Nintendo Power, it was too late in the console's lifespan to get the proper attention it deserved. At its core, Metalstorm is a platforming shooter similar to Contra or Mega Man. The player controls a humanoid mech, progressing from left to right, jumping on platforms, shooting robotic enemies, and avoiding bullets and hazards. At the end of each stage is a boss to defeat. Aim up while jumping, however, and this formula gets turned literally upside down as the gravity of the stage reverses itself. The player will fly upward and land feet first on the ceiling. All the enemies of the stage will also fly from ground to ceiling or ceiling to ground, as the case may be. Pressing down and jump while upside down will reverse this process and shift gravity again. This ability is not possible twice without touching the ground between a gravity switch, so to prevent the player from rapidly switching gravity and levitating throughout a stage, it's a subtle nuance that keeps the gameplay challenging. At first, wrapping your head around platforming and avoiding bullets while upside down seems daunting. Thankfully, the game eases you into the gravity mechanic, starting simple and becoming more complex later. While there are only 6 real stages, each presents a very unique challenge that demands creative exploitation of gravity switching. While one stage might feature conventional platforming, the next will scroll endlessly in the vertical dimension or will wrap the floor with the ceiling. Platforms alternate spikes on the top or on the bottom. Many enemies and barriers will alter their behavior depending on how gravity is shifted. Levels are not merely challenges to overcome, but puzzles to solve. In true IREM fashion, many of the levels require extensive trial and error to discover the perfect route. Most situations that appear at first to require twitch reflexes and impeccable timing actually have a much safer solution, but this approach to level design comes at a cost. Much like the R-Type series, Metalstorm requires memorization to survive. It is fun to retry a stage over and over until you discover the path through it, but several hazards and challenges feel almost unfair the first time you run into them. You need to be prepared to deal with a little frustration to successfully beat this one. Aside from the stages, the bosses are equally challenging, but feel a lot less creative. Half of the bosses wouldn't feel out of place in any other run-and-gun game, and most can be beaten without ever reversing the gravity. The boss after beating the final stage feels like an even bigger letdown, because the game just forces you through a gauntlet of all previous bosses, one after another. You'll spend much more time with the stages than the bosses, because if you die on a boss, you'll need to replay the entire stage leading up to it again. Metalstorm is a great-looking NES game, which makes sense since it came near the end of the lifespan of the resilient console. The mechanized enemies, stages, and the player all sport an abundance of detail and color. The player sprite in particular has very detailed animations and looks fantastic in motion. The enemies look robotic, but some come across as a little too generic and abstract. The backgrounds are similarly detailed, but also abstract. It isn't often clear just where the game is supposed to take place. Metalstorm is also notable for using a fake form of parallax scrolling to give the illusion of depth between the backgrounds and foreground. Even so, you won't be focused on the background artwork very much. You'll be a little preoccupied with not dying. On that note, you might be more focused on the hitbox of your player. It feels a bit off. It's a rectangle, while the sprite of the M308 gunner is a bit thinner near the head. That means when dodging some diagonal lasers and bullets, you might get hit when the bullet never collided with the sprite at all. It's rare, but a few later bosses will take advantage of this. All in all, this is a minor complaint for the game. The sound is composed of the familiar shooting and jumping blips and beeps you might find in Mega Man or Contra, but it sounds appropriate if not outstanding. The music is very catchy, but not overly memorable. Metalstorm is by no means perfect, but whatever can be said about it, the game was well ahead of its time. It contains a brilliant and creative concept with level design that pushes that concept to its limit. Action game fans and even more strategic and tactical gamers will find plenty to enjoy here. With a few very slight improvements, particularly the boss fights, this should have been a game that changed the run-and-gun genre. Alas, releasing at the tail end of the NES lifespan means Metalstorm was overshadowed by larger releases, and now remains unfortunately obscure. This little piece of forgotten gaming history deserves to be played, if only to experience the mind-bending concept it was built on.